what soon grew out of the disciplines of functionalism and structuralism within psychology is what could be called behaviourism. And that was the systematic investigation of how sensory information would then influence behaviour, and how the consequences of behaviour could then influence future behaviour. And what we'll explore in this section is some of the key fundamental people that were considered the founders of behaviourism, and how that had a huge influence on psychology within across the 50s and the 60s and even into the 70s, in terms of what psychology was, and its focus on stimulus and response, and the idea that you could scientifically investigate these parameters and manipulate them very powerfully to produce some very convincing results. And this rise of behaviourism had a big influence on psychology being recognised as science. So let's explore this a little bit further. Ivan Pavlov, you may have heard of him before. He was a Russian physiologist. He originally worked with Wundt, so some of his ideas originally come out of Wundt's lab, but he was very much interested in conditioned reflexes, and that is the idea that in in physiology at the time, there was a lot of recognition of how muscular reflexes could occur. And what Pavlov was interested in is a salivary reflex, the idea that you would salivate when food was presented. And he conducted a series of experiments in dogs looking at how the salivation response was occurring in the process of feeding. But what he quickly discovered was that when he was running his experiments, the dogs would start to learn to anticipate when they were going to be fed. And because they started anticipating when they were going to be fed, they started salivating before he actually started his experiment. And what's interesting about this is quite a classic example, which occurs quite often in science, is some of the greatest discoveries are those that occur by accident. But what separates these out as great discoveries is when the scientist is a good scientist, and a good scientist practices good observation skills. And what Pavlov did is he accommodated his experiments to look at this phenomenon. And this led to the concepts of classical conditioning that we know today. So the idea was that the preconditions of the experiment, such as the sounds, and for instance what's classically cited is the sound of a bell before the presentation of the food, would lead to an association between that bell and the food, so that eventually just the ringing of the bell would produce a salivation response. And I'm sure you've all experienced that in your everyday life. So if you've got a pet, if you ever engage in, feeding them nightly or in the morning, you'll notice that your animal will often anticipate when they're being fed, because there'll be certain things that you do leading up to the act of feeding. So it might be getting the tin out of the cupboard, or it might be getting out your can opener, but they quickly build up an association between those pre-feeding activities and being fed. And this is what happened in his experiment, but he capitalized on that, did systematic experimentations, which led to the discovery of classical conditioning. Now, in parallel, Edward Thorndike was working in the United States, and he was very interested in the relationship between stimulus and response. And his most famous experiments were the puzzle box experiments in cats. What he would do is he would put cats in a cage, which had certain levers that needed to be pulled for the cat to be able to escape and receive a food reward. Now, when he first observed cats in the cage, basically their behaviour would be random, and he argued that eventually, over the time, the cats would discover the way to open and escape the cage purely by repetitive trial and error. But once the cats conducted the appropriate behaviour to receive the food reward would then influence their subsequent behaviour. So they would learn that a pairing of particular types of behaviours would lead to the food reward. So he principally argued that the consequences of a behaviour would lead to a manipulation of that behaviour. So if the consequence of a behaviour was a reward, that behaviour would then increase in its frequency. And this was essentially his law of effect. And what made the work of Thorndike and Pavlov possible was this notion that looking at animals and looking at animal behaviour, we could understand some fundamental aspects of not just animal cognition, but also this would be applicable to humans. So Thorndike's work with puzzle boxes led to this notion of law of effect, which was one of the most fundamental tenets of what would later become behaviourism in terms of concepts such as operant conditioning that was explored by B.F. Skinner, which I'll get to soon. So John Watson took the ideas of Thorndike and wrote a book called The Behaviourist Manifesto. And in this, he basically slammed introspection, heavily criticised introspection as not a scientific method. And he argued that the only real way that we could have a science of psychology would be to focus on what we could observe and what we could quantify. And he argued that only stimulus and response would be things that we could manipulate, observe and quantify, so these things should be the only things that we have in a science of psychology. And he also argued for the use of animals as a model for human behaviour. And he was very famous for arguing that environmental influences were very important and were essentially everything in our learning. So one of the most famous quotes that Watson made was as follows: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select: doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, thief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, perchance, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. I'm going beyond my facts, and I admit it, but so have the advocates of the contrary, and they have been doing it for many thousands of years." So what Watson started to propose, not just to his colleagues, but to the public in terms of his publications, was that the environment was everything, and that given the right circumstances, even the most lowly person from low socioeconomic status, from people that were considered inferior races at the time, could be, under the right circumstances, become anything he so desired, and that given right environmental circumstances, anyone can become a rich contributor to society. Now, this had a huge impact, especially in the American psyche at the time, and it was very much aligned with American views of equal rights and the land of opportunity. And this paved the way for more open opportunity for education and for opportunities for people from a range of different types of socioeconomic status and race at the time. So his perspectives were very influential and quite contrary to what had been in the past, which were more about inheritance and genetic stock and people's inherited ability to be what they were. So Watson's behaviourism basically described relationships between stimulus and response, and he made quite grandiose claims about the importance of education and environment over inherited characteristics and instincts. I guess one of his most dramatic examples of how learning could have profound influences on behaviour, and particularly the development of a phobia, was his Little Albert experiment, which is very much a famous experiment, but maybe for the reasons of good ethical conduct rather than a good demonstration of behavioural principles. Basically, what he did is he exposed a very young toddler to a small white rat and olive fluffy animals, showing initially that the child had no fear response to those creatures. But then what he would do is he would present the rat with a very loud banging of a pipe, which would condition a fear response in that child, and then he presented the rat on its own after a series of trials with the loud distressing noise, and he basically demonstrated that the child then had a fear response to the rat, but this also generalized to a range of other fluffy animals as well. But obviously this isn't the type of experiment we could do in modern psychology, so it's often cited in terms of being a poor ethical experiment. But what he tried to do was a very dramatic example of how environmental influences could create something such as a phobia. The work of Thorndike and Watson eventually led to what is often referred to as radical behaviourism in the position of B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner could be considered one of the most influential psychologists to date. Some of the work that he did on behavioural control in animals was very convincing and quite astounding. What he systematically did is he looked at the stimulus response arrangement and started to look at the consequences of behaviour. So, how positive reinforcement would influence behaviour. So, for example, it was already well established by Watson and Thorndike that if there was a reward at the end of a particular behaviour, that particular behaviour would increase in frequency. But what Skinner did was systematically look at those rewards in terms of how they were delivered, and he talked about different types of reward contingencies. And what he set up was different ways of rewarding an animal for its behaviour. So he would vary the frequency in which the reward was given, in terms of how frequently it was given and the timing that it was given, and so forth. And one of the things he discovered was that what he termed a variable ratio schedule was very powerful in terms of increasing desired behaviour, well and above that of rewarding every single time an animal did a desired behaviour. So if you rewarded an animal once every 5th time or once every 10th time on average, rather than rewarding it every time, that particular behaviour would increase dramatically in its occurrence. And basically that is the principle of gambling. When you're on a slot machine, you're basically doing a behaviour on the chance that you may be rewarded with a large reward, but on an infrequent ratio type of schedule. And that was very much the principles by which he used his initial animal experiments. And he was able to show some very complex and dramatic behaviours in rats, in mice, in pigeons, which were very convincing. And the principles of his operant conditioning paradigms, or his operant conditioning principles, are pretty much the principles that are used in animal training today. The reward schedules, the idea of things such as chaining, and that is the idea that if you train an animal to do a particular task and then given a reward intermittently, you can then get the animal to do another task and then get that reward. So you link or chain those behaviors together. So what you often see in animal performances, for example, that animals do very complex behaviors, and every so often they get a little reward from their trainer. So they're on a variable reward schedule, but their training is being built up from a single behavior to a secondary behavior to a third to a long length of behaviors that the animal must do in order to get that reward on a variable ratio schedule. And yeah, so he did some very elegant, systematic investigations of how rewards could be set up to maximize behavioral outcomes. And he published very famous books. One book was called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And what he argued in that was some quite radical. He put forward some quite radical propositions, and that was that all of our human behaviour was a consequence of our reward contingencies that society set up, and that our perceptions of things such as free will and our notion of free choice was actually something that wasn't real, and that all we were doing as part of society was reacting to reinforcement contingencies. And this was very controversial at the time, but some of the demonstrations that he made in animals were very convincing, and form the basis of animal training today. Also, there were things such as token economies, basically little reward systems, which are still used for education in young children and in children that have intellectual disabilities. A lot of these behavioural principles are still used. So Skinner and his what we could call radical behaviourism, which was based on the principle he called operant conditioning, was very influential in the discipline of psychology right through the 50s to 60s, right up into the 70s. So experimental psychology had a lot of fundamental origins, with Wundt starting the first experimental psychology lab and the beginnings of structuralism. We also had alongside it the beginnings of functionalism, and from these developed the behaviouralist work of Pavlov, Thorndike, Watson, and Skinner. And this developed into what was often referred to as behaviouralism aspect of psychology.